Welcome to 5 Dubs by MDDC Press. I'm your host, Rebecca Snyder, the Executive Director of the Maryland, Delaware, and DC Press Association, which represents news media in our region. 5 Dubs focuses on the who, what, when, where, and why of local news media. We'll talk with the journalists about the stories behind the news. You can find more information about our guests in the show notes or on our website, www.5-dubs.com. Welcome, Steve Waldman, to the studio of 5 Dubs. I'm delighted to have you here.
Great to be here with you.
Yeah. So, Steve, for listeners who don't know Steve's illustrious world in journalism, he is now the founder and I think it's CEO of Rebuild Local News, but you've had a long history in transforming journalism. So we're going to talk today about some of the amazing things that Rebuild has done legislatively. But let's kind of start from the start, and I want to understand how you arrived at sort of the policy making machine that you are today. And in not necessarily you're not on the white horse saving journalism, but you're doing your part and have done your part in really interesting and diverse ways. So tell us a little bit about how you got here.
Well, if I go way back, I was a traditional magazine journalist for the first part of my career. I worked at Newsweek and U.S. News and World Report in Washington area, Washington Bureau. And around 1999, 2000, I left that to create a website called BeliefNet, which was a religion website, because I was so excited about the way the new technology might, change the way we could tell stories. And I did that for about 10 years and then went to work for the Federal Communications to do a report for them on, hey, this corruption, what's it doing to the news industry? And I did a report that said the concerning area is going to be that time we were all worried about national media being devastated. Kind of said that'll, there'll be lots of changes, but the area where the fallout will be local. And that is really what set me off on the focus on, because I had this wonderful experience. The taxpayers being me to around the country and in newsrooms about what was happening. And that led to another, one of which was an of Reports for America, which is like a but for local reporters. And it places reporters talented reporters into local newsrooms. There's this big competition to be in the program, and then subsidizes the salaries. The Report for America pays for half the salary, and the local newsroom and the community hopefully pays for the other half. And they've placed hundreds of different reporters there. And that was what I was really working on. But while I was doing that, I started to get this gnawing feeling that this kind of philanthropic intervention was not going to be enough. That it was important. We needed the business model changes that we've all been working on. We need more philanthropy, but that we also needed public policy to be smart about the severity of this crisis, why it's so important for communities, and to come up with public policy approaches that could help generate revenue for local media in a way that also preserves editorial independence, which is sort of the riddle of public policy in this policy making in this world. Like, it's not as simple as, oh, let's have the government give out grants to local news organizations. That would be terrible. You have to do it in a First Amendment friendly way. So a few years, I started this informal coalition about 6 years ago. And then 3 years ago, we spun this out as a organization called Rebuild Local News. There's a coalition of 55 organizations from all over the country, publishers associations, labor union, foundation, various groups effort really focused on reviving local news. We started off focused on federal legislation, but really for the last 2 or 3 years, have been working on passing laws at state legislatures.
Well, and so I love the coalition that you've built because it brings in, I feel like in many respects, journalism has kind of been on its own for a long time because as an industry, we don't like to say that we need help. We like to stay super independent. But when you center local news in a robust society, it affects
Yeah.
everyone. And so I'd love to hear from you sort of like the why of local news. Um, and sort of what that means that local news is diminishing now.
Yeah, and I'd say we're getting better at talking about it this way, but we still have a ways to go in terms of articulating what's going on to folks outside of our local news world. But yeah, we've been trying to make the thing, and being in the public policy realm, as you know, because you've been doing this longer than I have, you have to make the case not just as, oh, this is our industry and we need help. You need to make broader arguments for why this is good for the community or the state. So it forces us to articulate some of these things that are true. And, we kind of break it down into three categories. There's specific harms, which is, people don't have basic information about their communities, which makes it very hard to know who to look for. It makes it hard to be engaged to solve problems. It, in general, leads to lower voter turnout, lower participation, less volunteering at the PTA meeting even. So those are like specific harms. Then there are the economic harms. The ways in which having a lackluster or non-existent media actually economic communities, both in terms of there's one study that showed that the borrowing of local government higher when it is because investors figure there's no one watching the store, and so borrowing costs will really go up. And just in general, we lose this symbiotic relationship between small businesses in a community and the mainstream media. It kind of undermines the whole economic system. And then the third bucket, which is a little maybe less easy to quantify, but really important, has to do with polarization and division in the communities, which is really important to people, as it should be. And it's this idea that when local news contracts, that vacuum is filled by national media and social media for the most part. And those have real problems to it. They are tend to be more divisive and more likely to spread misinformation. So those are kind of the ways we try to explain what's at stake here. And also the other thing we try to convey is the severity of it really mind-boggling. We've seen about a 75% drop in the number of local journalists in about 25 years. That makes it one of the most contracted industries in the entire economy. I heard one professor say that the only other industries that have contracted this fast are VHS cassette makers, and I think like Blockbuster stores or something like that. So it is a catastrophic collapse, very, very severe and pretty rapid. This all happened in 20 years. And the consequences are really broad based for communities.
Well, and I think also when you think about like the large urban centers, when you see that contraction, it's really hitting small rural communities
Mm-hmm.
and your urban populations. That's where more people are, and so I think it's this hidden epidemic in some ways that really is coming more and more to light as there are more local news deserts and so forth. And so I think your thoughts about philanthropy is not going to save the world, and I don't think philanthropy is going to save the world because there's so much need out there and not enough
Right.
money.
Right.
Um, but centering local news in the political space to say this is something that we all need. And so I want to understand the policy pieces, and we've worked together on policy through a couple years, and we had a great win this year. but I brought you here to really talk about what Rebuild's doing at the state level, because we know nothing's happening on the federal level. So what's your strategy as you're going into different states? I'm a big fan of your model legislation, but I wanted you to articulate sort of your buckets and how you're working to make this change locally.
Well, you're being very humble. I mean, one of the key buckets and one of the biggest victories is the one that you led and that Maryland led. So let's start there. And that is government advertising, pushing more government advertising toward community media. So in other words, government already spent a lot of money on it. This isn't new money, money they're spending away. And what you did in Maryland and what we've been trying to do in other states is to say, let's make sure some of that goes to local media, that it gets spent in the state instead of to Google and Facebook and national media. So it kind of where the appeal, I'm sure you found, is that it's not a big new spending program. It's money that they're going to spend anyway. And it's kind of a buy local. It's like, let's spend this in the state. And of course, we think that the argument goes well beyond that because we think that this money is actually could be a lifeline for local media. And there's evidence. Like the real pioneers of this approach were folks in New York City and the City University of New York Journalism School kicked this whole thing off. They did a report that found that New York City, which has a whole state's worth of ad spending there, that most of the money was going to national media, and there are hundreds of little community publications there, and they were getting almost nothing. So they got the city council in New York to say 50% of the money ought to go to community media. This shifted $72 million to community media in New York City over 5 years. So it was transformative, and it didn't cost an additional penny for the government. It just made them be more conscious. So they weren't just getting it by kind of reacting to the vendor was that was doing kind of this thing. Now we never, we always are careful to say government agencies have the flexibility to be effective and have to spend the money. Right? You're not making it, stuff that isn't going to work. But so much of the spending has been autopilot, going out, really taking confidence and deliberate getting into it. So anyway, so let's take this new model and spread it around the land. And Maryland is the first state in the country to do this. With the leadership and the leadership of Delegate Foley and other great people in the state, and some of the other media advocated for this. So we've been taking that model and try to spread it elsewhere. New Jersey is probably the next one to take this up in a serious way, but we're pushing it in a market. So that's one, government advertising. Another one is tax credits to subsidize newsrooms that retain or hire local reporters. So this is going directly at the core issue, and we're not being enough people to cover communities. And it's now capped in 2 states, New York, Illinois, and just recently New Mexico. Illinois is the next one to implement, and it's really going well. It had, I think it was 200 something reporters that are supported by this 50 newsroom. And basically, you get where it works in Illinois is you get $15,000 per reporter for a current reporter, and then you get $10,000 for a new hire. So it has an extra little incentive to. And it's functioning well. What I like about this, you don't need a grant writer. You just fill out your tax form, and it's a simple way of engaging the process. It's relatively objective, quantitative. What you want to try to avoid is a requirement that none of the government has to look at the quality of organizations or look at the. We're trying to steer away from it. Just number of people, X number of people, Y dollar amount. That's the subsidy. But what we like about this approach is, even though it's like a simple, blunt instrument, the incentives are pointing in the right direction. If you hire more people, you're going to get more money. If you cut half your staff, you're going to get less. And so it's definitely potential to really scale. And in Illinois, the other thing we found is it got into small towns. Because one of the problems that you sometimes see with philanthropy is they do great work, but it tends to gravitate into big cities. And this program is really gotten into small towns and small newsrooms. 2/3 of the money in Illinois has gone to newsrooms with 6 or fewer staff. So that's the employment crowd. And as I said, New Mexico just a couple of weeks ago passed their own version of this. There's now 3 states. A third idea is gets called fellowship. It's really like the Report for America model that I was describing earlier, where it's emerging journalists that get placed into local newsrooms, usually for like 2 years. But unlike Report for America, which is a private program, we now have 3 states that are doing the same thing, having the split patient. So Washington State, California, and New Mexico have all done this. And they have, in the case of California and Washington, it's been administered by a local journalism school. So again, the government is deciding converges. That's one of the J schools, and they have a competitive examinations, quality, and then the state is subsidizing the salary. I think in California, they now have 40 reporters in the field just from this program, being managed by the UC journalism. So that's an interesting model too. If you're really right for the reporting, you're trying to make First Amendment safe because it's several steps removed from right in the journalism administrator. So that's interesting. And then the fourth category is a very different angle, but I really find this very creative, which is tax relief for small businesses that advertise in local news. It's like a bank guy where a subsidy is actually going to restaurants and hardware stores and other small businesses if they advertise in local news. So it's in some ways it's a real marketing subsidy for the small businesses. So it's a really it's equally a economic development bill to them as it is to the media. But because it helps them with their marketing efforts. But it also, we're hoping you'll kind of reignite, strengthen the symbiotic relationship that used to exist, very important between Main Street businesses and mainstream media. So there's some other ideas. Oh, one other one that is a new idea in this, which is something that happened in Utah. So this is a little bit of a different thing, and this just happened recently too. So Utah, which is a very conservative Republican state, just imposed tax on big tech, on social media platforms. And they're using the funds, and they're going to use the funds for 2 things. One is in mental health programs, and the other civic information programs. And there's a lot that was fascinating about this. But the argument for civic information programs is, it basically, if you want to try to combat polarization, which is part of why they did this, you have to revive community news. It has to be part of this to prepare communities fighting polarization. So, we worked aggressively in Utah to make that, in addition to the teen mental health problems, which is a very serious issue too, that they should include this information disorder, as they were calling it. Now, because it was Utah, the way they framed it was really interesting. They called it a fix. And they basically said, and it's all Republicans, this is proposed by Governor Spencer Cobb. And presumably the final fourth state majority leader, conservative, said, social media is the big tobacco of our time. And they're hurting our. And what did we do to big? We sued them and we taxed them. And they actually are involved in some lawsuits. And they said, so that's what we got to do. But for them, part of the point was spending the money on these good things, but part of it was just to have the tax to, kind of fight back in their view against tech companies that are doing this. So I thought it was a really important moment action because it was the first time that any state had enacted a law that connected something like a tech tax with information, community information. Like Maryland, as you know, has it right now. It was actually, I think, the first state that did it. And being first and caught up in the courts and, is getting roughed up a little bit. But it was, I believe, for general order. Or it was not for news. It was not for community journals. So Utah said it took it, and they learned from Maryland, actually. They were very conscious of Maryland's legislation and what they should do differently and stuff like that. But Utah took it a step further and said that one of the purposes of this should be to help with it.
Well, and I think we're seeing a lot of legislatures across the country thinking about how they can take a swipe at big tech or how they can cash in, I guess, on big tech. But I think you're right. Like in Maryland, that money went, I think, either straight to education or to the general fund because Maryland had a big structural deficit that they needed to close. But that idea that social media and that big tech is something that needs to be reined in is really sort of coming to the forefront. But connecting the dots to bring that back to, we want local media to fill that space again is something that not all states are doing. So in Utah, you talked about it as a sin tax, as a, that it was more of a swipe than a lifting up of local news, although and civic information, I think, is what the fund came in. So was that, did you have to make a lot of pitches for that, or was it sort of a natural handshake?
Yeah, it was fascinating, really. Like, the governor's office was very receptive of the argument from the beginning. The idea that, because Spencer Cox has been really very eloquent in talking about bridging divides. When he was the head of the Governors Association, he did this thing called Disagree Better, which is all about Republicans and Democrats learning how to talk to each other again. So they were from day one very open to the argument that live and community media could be part of this discussion. They had concern politically hurt. And so we had to convince them and the other folks in the legislature that there were ways of doing this that would be politically acceptable, fit in with the argument that we made, but not make it look like it was a big handout to the local news media. And, there were we just had to make the argument. And the fact that it was phrased as, civic information programs as opposed to subsidizing news outlets was intentional because we wanted to focus people on what the point of this was. It's not about bailing out the news industry. It is actually about strengthening coverage in communities. And the other thing that we did was we tried to educate people about the fact that what we basically been talking about is there are ways of doing it. This don't involve the government putting your thumb on the scale for some rewarding or punishing you guys. You could be forgiven in these days and times, thinking like, oh God, this is just going to lead to rewarding or punishing you guys. And so we felt like we had an obligation and a need to actually walk people through how you could do this in the way that. And the most of the example we gave was the one I mentioned before. It's like, how about we use this to provide tax relief for small businesses that advertise in local news? And that's not formally in the legislation that passed. In fact, the way the bill is written is that part where it says where the money would go to it can go to this. They still need a second piece of legislation that will actually allocate the money. So there's like a round two to this that's going to be very important.
Right. So this was enabling legislation that'll tee up the next.
Exactly. So we have still make the case for that particular approach or something like that that will help the community use. But we definitely planted the flag and made a lot of friends and, real supporters for this. And, I think the governor's approach has been very receptive. So it'll, it'll still be a fight. Oh, and the other thing I should say is we're expecting the tech companies to sue if stop the law from going into effect. That could happen any day. I think the law actually goes into effect in May. So it could be that what's actually going to happen is there's going to be years worth of court, more. We're going to work on track to kind of get the rest of the stuff teed up. But the court cases are going to be.
Well, and that also, I think, when we're talking about new taxes or things where you're taking from one and giving to another, that does lead to litigation for sure. Like Maryland's digital ad tax, was in dispute, and I think still is. You've got the tech tax that is under dispute now. Those are really powerful industries that do not take kindly to saying you have to pay your fair share. I mean, you look at what's happening with AI and whatnot. So, I wanted to ask you, like, how you choose your initiatives. It sort of seemed like the syntax idea kind of came up and is related to your buckets, but like, how much is opportunity and how much is like research based? This is where we think we should go, because you're kind of riding a lot of ponies, especially when you extrapolate that over 50 states.
Yeah, it's true. I wish, when we were just doing Congress, it was in some ways a lot easier. But on the other hand, harder to get something passed. So we're glad to be
and now
working.
you have 50 labs. Isn't that nice?
Yeah, the whole laboratory of democracy thing is totally working in this case. Like, we're doing these really interesting experiments. And also, like, some of these ideas are pretty new, and we should have some humility about the fact that we don't know for sure what's going to be the best one. So I love the idea of having 5 different ideas out there, each being done by different states, and let's see what works best, or what combination. Yeah, the tax part was a little bit of an outlier for us in the sense that we've always been sympathetic to taxes as the way of paying for this, but it was not really the point of it for us. The point of it was getting help to local newsrooms. And like when New York and Illinois did their employment credit, they didn't have a dedicated tax. They just took it out of revenue. That was fine with us. So we don't lead with the tech tax, but when asked or when told that we're going to need a way of paying for this that's specific, we think the tech tax is the fair, logical way to do it. And so we're a little on the fence of like, how much do we lean into that? I think it's still a little bit more a mixed win for us than it is the point. But it comes up all the time. And there is an additional argument for doing something like that, which is, if you come up with a good law, you have to go back to the legislature every year to get it appropriated. You're putting yourself in a very vulnerable position. I mean, you've been in this route. Like, you don't want to have to go up every year and ask payroll of some program. That really is, the news media making people that are covering to some degree. So the ideal thing is either a long lead time authorization for something, or you have a dedicated revenue. And so that's hard to do, come up with dedicated revenue streams. But it might create an extra layer of insulation or sturdiness for some of these policies. But we'll see. And, the other element of the tech debate that we're dipping our toe into is data centers and AI. It's a little bit of it's a more of a new policy dilemma. We had a proposal to draft, and this is really just an op-ed to get a conversation started that said, hey, if communities are negotiating with data centers for community benefit agreement around subsidizing housing or repairs, they should ask for one more thing: create an endowment to hire a reporter to cover the data centers, make sure that they maintain things like that. On the broader question, like how we decide which one of these things. So we did actually, at the beginning of our lives, start off with lots of conversations about what are the core principles that we should be going by. And they have really up, I would say. They really helped guide us. So it has to be content neutral. We're not going to sit here and say, oh, we only want high quality content, or we only want content about this topic or that topic. We don't think that good. Foundations can do that. Readers can do that. Government cannot. So content neutral, platform neutral, meaning it should be available, whatever we come up, available to newspapers, but also websites and radio stations and anyone who's doing real community coverage. Another principle that we have, hardest to do, is that it be future friendly. What we mean by that is like a lot of times when public policy is made, it's kind of made for the existing players. Because that's, yeah, that's who,
because that's who's in the room.
That's who's in the room. And to some degree, that's totally fine and appropriate. But our world is changing so fast and needs to. We don't want to like pull the ladder up new players. We want this to be able to help new models that we might have not even thought about yet, if they're doing the core functions of covering communities. So we try to use those basic parameters, and then we look at practical things, like, is it possible? This, we don't have enough money in all 50 states and gun states that are going to have a shot. So we tend to pick states where there's a real chance. And on top of that, we also do try to have a mix of purple and red states, because we don't like the idea that it might become just party cause with Republicans reflecting against it. That could kind of backfire and create almost a worse situation. So that's like how we just.
Well, and I think actually a couple things I wanted to pull out of there, because it does, when you're in that 50 lab scenario, you do have to think about who your partners are, like what states are looking to which other states for groundbreaking legislation. Like in Maryland, we're always seemingly following California and New York, and so there are some states that gravitate towards others. And then kind of the complications of, you get into who decides and who, like, you don't want to pick winners and losers because you're trying to be flexible enough to grow and to grow into the future, and stable enough to satisfy your platform. So where, and it feels like between New Mexico and Maryland and Utah, you're pretty much across the whole country. Are you finding, though, that there's a particular appetite for these bills in a region, or a particular type of legislature, or is it all just, opportunity and you're jumping on it?
Well, I would say that the other factor that we look at is whether or not there are good local leaders. That determines, we can have a great idea and, political math, but if there aren't local groups to take the lead that we can help, it's really hard to pull off with us just going in. So we really prefer to work with local players. So sometimes there might be a state that in a lot of ways is perfect, but there's not like a local leader just to take it on. And we have to kind of not do that. We still have our line. I would say the thing that doesn't seem to be a regional pattern. I would say what we learned in the last year or two is we started with 8 or 9 different ideas, and we winnowed it down to 4. And that's because those are the 4 that have gotten traction. Those are the 4 that seem to have appeal. So we tried other things too that we haven't talked about that just didn't go anywhere. So we learned from that, and these 4 seem to be the ones that have appeal in different places.
And so you're creating, at least in Maryland, what I found super helpful was that you had model legislation, not like hardcore, you have to do it this way, but you had suggested language. And whenever I had an issue or someone said, oh, well, we need to do this to make it palatable, it was so helpful to be able to call your staff and say, I need the words. What are the legislative words that get this done? Because you've thought about this. So, when you're building model legislation, how does that work? Are you kind of just taking like, well, this is what seemed to have worked here, and like you've got a laundry list of if then statements, or how do you
Yeah,
conceptualize it?
I would say we've learned a lot, over the last 3 years on how to do this. And we're in a much better position now than we were 3 years ago because we have real life. When we were starting with it, it was a little bit of an abstract project. Like you're coming up with ideas, a piece of paper, and challenging each other on the logic of it, but we didn't have a lot of real world counter, testing. Now there's real world constantly revising things based on real world experience. But the model bill, the way we usually approach, we have a model bill on the government advertising, we have model bill on small business, tax relief for small businesses that advertise, and in a few weeks we'll be in the model bill for the employment tax credit. And usually what you do is you say, what are the must-haves? Like, there's going to be various. There are some judgment call where you might have an opinion, but it's local circumstances may dictate it. So we divide things up into the must-haves and the discretionary topics. Must-haves is becomes the core of the model bill, and we get it down into legislative language. And you can, everyone has to adapt it to refer to the right portions of the tax code or whatever. Hey, so you can't just literally copy it as is. You can get quite far along the kind of must-haves, and then we have a sort of bucket of actually guidance more than else that are like those if-then statements. So, like, if you want to, in the case of come out students, some states have put caps on how much the newsroom can get, and other states haven't. So the model keeps that blank. Basically, it doesn't say anything about caps. But then we'll have a separate kind of module that says, if you think we're doing caps, here's some things to think about. If you want to do a cap on the newsroom, here's how you're going to do it. If you want to do a cap on how much a whole chain could get, here's how to do that. So it's an interesting process that honestly I didn't know anything about until 3 years ago. But it's, other industries and sectors use model bills all the time. And so we didn't invent the concept of model bills, but as far as I know, this is the first time it's been done for this cause.
And actually, Steve, it just like has hit me as you were talking, like you don't have a legislative background. Like you kind of jumped into this and like you didn't have a history of lobbying or whatnot. You just had ideas like this is what we think should happen. So that's a huge learning curve. Like, how has it scarred you?
I covered the legislature for many years. Well, I covered Congress. I covered Congress for 10 years. I actually wrote a book about how the legislative process works. So I knew it as a journalist, but that is really good. I mean, it wasn't nothing. Like I do, because I spent a lot of time studying legislative process as a journalist, a lot of this is very familiar to me. The part that's been a learning curve for me is advocacy. It's been less the like the mechanics of the legislative process, which I think I've been, learning about as a journalist over the years. But I've never been an advocate. I never process of figuring out how to build a code, what the arguments are that are going to work, what the order of importance, who you recruit a legislator back, all the stuff how to do in creating an advocacy strategy and campaign and effort. That was new. And that has been a learning curve. Fortunately, I have surrounded myself with many very smart people, both on staff, but also in the broader network. And that's part of why we lean into helping other people who are there. Like, there's all sorts of folks, not just you, other folks that have some version of prevention who know the children in that area, often have experience in advocacy themselves. And so we can help with the particular policy and the parts that are more pioneering and lean into that. So it's gotten me through them.
Well, it takes a team, and it is I think it's really interesting when you think of, not the mechanics of the process, but like the art of the process. Like when you're building your panel for testimony, like it's almost like theater, because everybody has their 2 minutes and you need to make sure that everybody has what they're supposed to say. And you have to recognize that legislators are in and out of their hearing. They're not really paying attention. So it forces you to hone what's really important. And I think sometimes we all get really passionate about what we're trying to do, and nobody wants to hear more than just a little bit of your passion. They want to hear your point too, which is tough. In 2 minutes, that's really hard for sure.
Yeah.
Um,
And then,
and
as
so,
you know, like sometimes you spend as much time dealing with the politics among your friends as you do the politics among your opponents. Because the art of building a coalition, everyone has, most of the people in the local news world have the same general goal. But depending on how you write the bill, it might help to strip a little more than that group. And that's a very tough balancing act. And it's partially about fairness and transparency, just trying to be upfront with people. So everyone, at least even if they disagree with you, know that like you're trying to approach it in a good faith way. And some of it's math. It's coming, threading the needle in the way that people bought in. One of the things, we didn't have this issue in Maryland so much, but it has been an ongoing issue, is we try to get local news groups to focus on what they might get out of this, opposed to focusing on making sure they can exclude people they don't like. There's a lot of energy going into, I don't think those people should get anything. And some of it's on principle. There's important issues about corporate media, and like, would be really subsidizing media that's run by a hedge fund, and there's tough issues there. But we shouldn't let that passion for exclusion block us from getting to a point that can basically help lots of different people.
well, I so agree with that. And when you look at the contraction of the industry, we lost 75% of our reporters. We should not be squabbling over, the scraps in the trough. Like, we should be working to get more in, because that will help everyone. And so I think that also but that's that scarcity mindset we're trying to move, in the new world, into the abundance mindset. There is plenty out there, and we have to stand together. And legislators don't understand those nuances about why they should like this group versus that group and so forth, because even, your large even the Gannett papers, those are all locally focused pubs. They may be owned by a large entity. We may quibble like, okay, do all those dollars stay in the local ecosystem? But they're still contributing. And when you look at, sometimes there's divisiveness between nonprofits and for-profits, and everybody loves the nonprofit world, but the number of reporters that are in those nonprofit worlds or newsrooms are dwarfed by the number in for-profits. And so we all need to think about how we're bringing, like, the point is to connect people with news and information that's relevant to their lives.
Yeah,
And
I
so,
completely agree. And, we get flack for that sometimes. Rebuild Local News does, because our coalition is very broad. We do have for-profits and nonprofits, and we do have publishers and labor unions and big city and little, and, they don't always get along. And sometimes they get mad at us for allowing, that other group into the bill or into the tent. But we completely agree with you. That's like fighting over the scraps. And we should, if we unite, we ought to be able intercept all the boats. And yeah, maybe some news organizations get help. So what? You're able to do your work and serve your community that you focus on.
Well, and I think also when we think about, and I want to get to implementation too. And oh gosh, we always have such a good time talking that it takes us a little bit longer. So I'll beg indulgence because I want to get to implementation. But in that idea of like who decides, one of the things that we really struggle, might be overstating it, but that we really try and discern is what constitutes local news, because you've got pink slime partisan news sites. You've got, you don't want anyone carpetbagging into your local territory, and so it was really helpful to have, we have our own laundry list because it's within our dues structure of like, you have to have original reported content, you have to have this, you have to have that to be considered for membership in our association. But all of these bills that and legislation that you're putting forward don't have the benefit of, you can't put in legislation that you have to be a member of the press association.
Right.
So can you talk a little bit about, how you are centering that definition of local news for an industry that's really loath to say who's a journalist and who's not?
Right. There's not a licensing board that says what a legitimate. It's probably the topic that we spend more time on than anything else, because it is so central in making these bills work, and it's hard. And as you said, if you're a trade association or if you're a foundation, you can make some subjective calls. Like you can look at their website, you can look at the publication, you can find out, and you can kind of know who, like, is this legit or not? You can make some good, but government programs work that way. You have to come up with objective standards that someone who works in the tax department, who doesn't know about all these different groups, and makes the relatively straightforward judgments. That's hard. That's like a real challenge. So we've come up with 4 or 5 metrics or standards that we think, if you stack them, no one of these is perfect by themselves, but if you do these things, that we think that they exclude the pink slime sites and things that are really political operations, masquerade or pure AI actions. So the most important one actually is that they have at least one full-time reporter in the area. It's sort of obvious, but you'd be surprised. Like a lot of the pink slime sites, and pink slime for your listeners, these are sites that look like a local news site. They've got a logo and a local name, but the content is not local. It's created, in Nevada, and oftentimes it's politically motivated. They almost never have a local staff. So the mere you have a local staff actually knocks out a lot of them. They're also very secret. So we found that if you just require that you disclose who your owners are, that actually knocks out a lot of people. One other thing that we put in there that was a little more controversial, but I think it works, is that we say that you need to have media liability. And the reason for that is that first of all, then you're getting from an outside body. The insurance company is going to look at you, and as they're trying to underwrite whether or not they want to give you liability, first they'll look at this too. So you have like another check in on it, and just that shows that you're conscientious and conscious about being accurate. So we try to do things like that, and those are kind of binary things. Like you can say, it doesn't say some kinds of ownership are legitimate and some are. It just says you have to disclose them. So those are kind of criteria that you can kind of check a box or not. And if you stack those all up, it seems pretty good.
Matt Pierce in your office described it. We were on a panel the other day, and he described it as like Swiss cheese. So like some people might get through the first layer of Swiss, but will be hit by the next, and so forth, and taken together.
When you add up all the slices of cheese.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's really helpful because it's not local news is not many people are like, oh, well, I know who my trusted sources are. But if you don't have a rubric or a framework, you don't know in the future as formats change and situations change, you need to, I think, be really clear about who you are and what you're trying to achieve
Right.
from the jump. And
Right.
so I wanted to, it's helpful to hear about that paradigm. And then I wanted to end on discussing implementation because you have all these successes, and like in Maryland our bill is awaiting signature by the governor, by Governor Moore, which we hope and don't think he will not sign it, so it should go into effect. But the details of every bit of legislation, you can have the best legislation ever, but if the implementation is muffed up, you're dead in the water. So you've got a lot of wins. How are you solidifying and capturing it? Because, I don't think you're hot potatoing it. What are you doing?
Right. No, it's a really important thing. I mean, if you look at our strategic plan from 3 years ago, it had 4 parts: policy development, advocacy, research, and implementation. But we hadn't really got the implementation part because we didn't really implement.
You got to pass something first, and so now you're set.
Now we have stuff to implement. And it's really important that, I spend some time trying to educate our funders. We're funded mostly by foundations and things like that the implementation part is critical. And it can mean things like sometimes there's implementing regulations. So like in New York and Illinois, the past law, but then they had to do implementing regulations. We want to weigh in on those for the implementing regulations are found. Then there's you pass something, but you need to make sure that local news organizations, smaller ones, know how to benefit. Well, first of all, that they know about it at all, but then that they know how to fill out the form, or they don't know how to get their questions answered. It sounds pedestrian, but it's really important. And we saw that in Illinois. Those folks that didn't apply just got up because they had a question and couldn't find someone to answer it, so they didn't apply. So that's that part. And then the third part is research on what's working, what the impact is. So we need to know what the impact is for our own advocacy purposes. Like you can be able to tell the story as it was, but as a more, objective matter, we also need to know what's working out so we can keep improving it. I know that sounds romantic. There's appetite to keep improving legislation over time, but well, maybe that's because there's a bunch of journalists that our organization take that seriously too. And so far, we've been lucky enough to be advocates who like that, who wanted to keep improving it. And it is also because these are sort of the early days, these are stories of democracy for these ideas, strength of local news. It's incredibly important we get it right and get it all right in the first. We have to be very attentive to what improved and kind of stay right on.
Well, and of course, I'm closest to our Maryland legislation, and so we were able to put into the legislation that a third party nonprofit could keep the list of what a local news organization is, and so our foundation has volunteered to be a part of that, partly so we can stay really enmeshed in that process. Because I see it as a couple different prongs. I mean, you're so right that we have to educate. Our own news organizations about how to take advantage of this particular bill, but any bill you have. But then for Maryland's set aside program, where state agencies are directed to put 50% of their advertising budgets, with a couple caveats, into local news, you have to kind of go and sell all of those. And so I've been and our session just ended April 13th. So in the intervening time, I've been having conversations with members, with agency officials, with as many people as I can find to kind of figure out what our rollout plan is going to be. And so we'll also be talking to people in New York and San Francisco that have started to implement this program to have lessons learned, because I feel like I want to create a playbook that then can go to the next state that passes this.
That's great. Yeah.
And, sort of our going thoughts are that we need to essentially get capability statements from everyone who's a local news organization to create kind of a lookbook that we can then say, okay, advertiser, these are your options. And then the other piece, and I think this is certainly not a failing of that bill, but just something to be cognizant of. It doesn't have an enforcement piece in it, and it doesn't have reporting in it. And that was a tactical decision because, again, the idea that you don't want to have an overly complex piece of legislation that people don't understand, or that agencies could say, well, that's too complicated. So we do need to figure out, how are we going to make sure we're monitoring in a meaningful way? Because it's hard to legislate culture, and this in some ways is right up there.
Well, I'm glad that you're all are stepping forward, because that was when we spent a lot of time studying the New York City experience, because they were the first ones and the significant program. And that was kind of what we concluded, was that the whole thing wouldn't have worked if CUNY's journalism school hadn't been kind of all over it. Like, they created the initial work, they worked with the city, and they kind of watchdogged it too. So there was a period, when the new mayor came in and they dropped the ball, and it was CUNY that was banging the drum, to get it back on track and to listen if there's any complaints, people who think there's favoritism or something like that. Having a third party like that's independent from the state is really important. And it's a little bit of a hard thing to legislate. I mean, it's good that they allowed for that, but if you hadn't stepped up, might have been a real problem. And in New York, it was CUNY. So whenever we work in the state, we always say, you can't require in the law exactly what the third party is going to be, but let's talk about it anyway. Who do you think the third party is going to be? Get everyone thinking about it and be ready to jump in. It's an informal thing, but it's just as important as the formal things.
Well, and it just strikes me that the tenets of journalism, like that independence from government, that watchdog, that accountability piece, that flavors all of what we're trying to do, and how to implement legislation. And I think it will be, if we think about how these coalitions are being built, it's not just within specific states, but you're building a coalition that's really sharing information across all of those lines. And so where we can work together, I think that's so important.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I just wanted to end, we're coming to the top of the hour. So tell me what's next for Rebuild. Do you have something special up your sleeve, or is it slogging in the trenches with the 4 ideas you have? What's coming up?
Well, the main thing is expanding the number of states. So we want to just take the ideas that seem to be working and get them into more states, do more in the way of the implementation. We have been beefing up our research arm. We released something last year called the Local Journalist Index, which was an attempt to inventory how many local journalists there were. A lot of the studies earlier had been on their outlets, which is important too, but we felt like it was understating the problem if we didn't have a sense of how many journalists there were. So we've been doing more on that. I think more work on figuring out the tech part of this that we started the conversation about. And then we want to get all the ideas to have their own model bill. We have two of our in our menu have model bill is coming soon, and we want to keep doing it. I guess there are a couple other ideas out there that I would say are less fully baked, but they are interesting. I could mention those.
All right, bring it on.
One actually is you dabbled with this in DC, is the idea of a consumer subsidy. So there was a bill a while ago that would have provided tax credits for consumers to buy subscriptions to newspapers. And then DC did a twist on it. It was kind of a voucher where you would check off where you wanted the money. I feel like none of these ideas quite gotten it right, but there's something very intriguing and appealing about the idea that public policy that enhances the consumer's buying power because it can be used for subscriptions, for donations. So I don't know about that. Just because we like haven't quite solved it yet, I feel like there's something there.
It'll bubble.
Yeah, and the maybe that has to be tried on a smaller scale somewhere, like in a small state or a county or something like that. The last thing I would say is there's a little bit of a movement in the philanthropic space to create new financial institutions for local news. As you probably know, it's a small media companies have credit for things they do. And especially if you want for, hiring a development or another ad sales person, something like that, where there's no like hard collateral to it, it's very hard to get any. You have like grant makers, the foundations on the one side, and you have private equity and venture capital on the other side, and there's not a whole lot in between. So we've been working with a bunch of different foundations to try to set up funds that would provide interest loans in the media. And then
it's like the Kiva for journalism,
Yeah, that's right. It's an original idea in bigger sense of it. Like other sectors of the economy had this all over the place. Housing and environment and things like that. But it doesn't really exist in our world. So there's a little bit of a movement around that. And that could end up with public policy elements too. Like maybe you could have government loan guarantees that, piggyback on some of the, So I'm getting way into the weeds with you, but you asked. But I think
and it's super interesting just because I think
baked, but still interesting ideas out there.
Well, and there's a lot of, I think, applicability from other industries and other areas that you can bring to journalism because journalism has kind of always held itself apart in some ways.
Yes.
And so being open in this intersectionality and sort of like when you think of an ecosystem approach, and I just finished Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake about the fungal networks in the world. So I'm really into the idea of like,
is it true that they talk the trees talk to each other?
100%, and it's all with the mycorrhizal. I've muffed up the word.
Microbial?
No, it's mycorrhizal, I think is how you say it. So yes, it'll blow your mind there. But how there's a lot of back and forth in those fungal networks that help the ecosystem survive. So it's not just winners and losers. It's a collaborative system where you need everything. And so I think that's very applicable to what you're building across journalism. And I think it's exciting times and we're on, and I love seeing the new research that's coming in to try and put some pins in what's working and what's not to move it from like we should just want this to this is a good financial and social decision. And I think having all those pieces really helps bring that in. So that's my soapbox for today.
We can probably have a minor bits of progress just kind of as an industry pushing for ourselves. But if we want to get public policy on the scale and creativity that is actually needed to reverse this, we're going to need to convince people outside of our orbit this is important. And I feel like we're making progress on that, but we have a ways to go to get people who don't know anything about Carolyn, who care about their communities, or care about democracy, or care about business, economic health of their community, like to make the connections for them of why having a healthy local news system is important to them too.
Yeah, because it's not always obvious to people. So thank you, Steve, so much for the work that you're doing. I can't wait to talk next year about the new wave of bills that have swept the nation with this public policy work. And I really appreciate your help getting our Maryland bill passed as well.
Oh, it was our pleasure. And thank you for leading the way on that and being the first state to pass that kind of law.
Yeah, very exciting. All right. Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to 5 Dubs with Rebecca Snyder. Please subscribe and leave us a 5-star review wherever you download your podcasts so that others can find us. What do you want to know about local journalism? Email me at rsnyder, SNYDER, at mddcpress.com. Interested in supporting our podcast and journalism? Please donate to our 501c3 Press Foundation. Find out more and see the full episode list and show notes at www.5-dubs.com.